What we've seen so far has been sort of US-centric, but as Kerry alluded to, the same concept applies with whatever country you're in. So the US, unfortunately, does not have a national building code, so it's a little bit different, and it could also be more challenging when you go outside the US. I'm going to try to tie all of this stuff together and demonstrate the role that you, and hopefully you can go out and talk to other ACI members to get people more engaged. Kerry highlighted that adoption is part of the mission. And if you look at the TCM, safeguard the public safety, health, and general welfare. That's, when you're writing a code, that is the intent of the code. We're a professional society. A professional society. If we write these codes and they're just sitting on the shelf somewhere, we didn't do our due diligence. We need to make sure that it gets to where it needs to be to safeguard the public. So we're not done when the committee is done with its work. There is this other step that needs to happen, which means we need to get these things adopted nationally, at the state level, whatever level it takes to make this happen. So I'm going to step back in time a little bit and give you how we ended up with this particular scenario that we're in now, or situation we're in now. We're looking at the first, again, tying all of this together. Dave mentioned some of this timeline, but 1910, we had the very first, what ultimately ended up being ACI 318. And it transitioned over time, and in 1956, one of the biggest changes to it was it added ultimate strength method in addition to working strength method. So we have this new code in 1956 with ultimate strength. Most of the building codes that were out there were still working stress, so there was a big push to try to get ACI 318 adopted in building codes across the United States. The very first chapter of ACI, the Southern California chapter, its charter included educating local officials about the need for them to adopt the ACI 318 code. So this is a key to how things used to happen and what we used to be doing. Well, back then, we didn't have these two national model building codes. We had regional model code groups. The first one being formed in 1927, or actually it was formed in 1922. They had their very first model building code, the Uniform Building Code, in 1927. National Building Code first appeared in 1950. Southern Standard Building Code also first appeared in 1950. So industry was working with these regional model codes to try to make things happen. But then we moved to these other model building codes. So we have the NFPA codes that Shamim talked about, as well as these 15 model codes maintained by the International Code Council. Of those, only some of them are of interest to the concrete industry. So these of those 19 model building codes, there's it's a little more simplified. We really don't have anything that needs to go into the electrical code, the plumbing code, or the mechanical code. But these are all places where ACI standards could improve these codes. Some of the information ACI has is currently only in the form of guides. A guide cannot be referenced in the building code because building codes are law. And in order for a law to be implemented, it must be written in mandatory language. So we may have great information out there that is useful to the practitioner, but we don't get it into the building code because it's not written in mandatory language. So prior to 2006, the only codes we had referenced in the model codes were ACI 318, going from 1941 to the current, the 1941 edition of 318 to the current one, which was reapproved in 2022, and ACI 216.1 on fire protection with concrete and masonry, which was first published in '97, and we're currently at a reapproved version in 2019. So we're looking at what's referenced in the model building codes. Well, we now shifted over to the predominant code in the United States that's used as the model for most jurisdictions is the ICC Model Building Code. From the get-go, we had 318 and 216 referenced. In 2006, the residential code was able to reference ACI 332, but that only happened because of the work with PCA 100, which is a prescriptive design criteria that's now being maintained by NRMCA. We needed to get the pre-engineered tables into the IRC before they could reference ACI 332. And that's because of the structure of the IRC. The residential code requires that everything be pre-engineered. So it's cookie cutter for a builder to go out and say, if I'm going to build it out of wood, this is the spacing of the wood studs, and this is the amount of sheathing, and even down to the number of nails. And the same type of thing applies to above-grade concrete construction. Kerry mentioned a little bit about new standards that are coming out. 322 is doing something on water shapes because what's required for water shapes in swimming pools is different than what is required in 350 for environmental structures. So it's trying to find a compromise. Right now, the building code says your swimming pool needs to be built to ACI 318. Well, 318 doesn't address leakage issues. So they needed a standard to address leakage issues, and that's what 322 is working on. International Energy Conservation Code, we now have 3 codes that can be adopted there. Two of those codes are also applicable for consideration in a commonly adopted, it used to be the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. They now just go by ASHRAE, but those standards could be referenced there. Kerry pointed out, you have 2 code advocacy engineers at ACI. We can't reach all these venues. Without the membership engagement, this doesn't happen. Even at the model code level, we typically need early adopters to testify at the microphone and say, yeah, we did that in North Carolina. You should consider that in the model code. So that's the type of things that happen. Some of our new codes aren't even written for the model codes that are out there. 332, the low carbon code, isn't even written for a specific building. It's written on the project basis. So since it's written on the project basis, it doesn't fit the building code because the building code is within the footprint of the building and it doesn't go outside that. So we need of an individual building, I should say, and it doesn't go outside that. So it was intentionally written for local ordinances that are already happening, government procurement procedures to fit into voluntary programs such as LEED and Green Globes and the Green Building Initiatives Carbon Reduction Program, as well as the Structural Engineering Institute SE 2050 program. So those are sort of voluntary programs where it needs to be referenced. Again, lots of venues, very few people currently involved. We need more people to get involved to make this happen and satisfy the mission of ACI, which is about getting these things adopted so we are indeed satisfying the role of making sure we are safeguarding the public. So there's all sorts of opportunities. If it's a guide, that doesn't mean we can't get the information referenced in other standards. We can. There is an ASCE standard on design and construction for flood resistance, ASCE 24. It references 318. But then in the commentary, it talks about these other ACI documents. There's things in those ACI documents that should be standardized to go into the body of the standard. There should be a mandatory language in the body of the standard, but it's not. So then what happens is you have this group of people who aren't concrete experts writing information that they think is right about concrete. So we need, as the concrete industry experts, to take control of our own destiny and put the right information into these documents. And typically it will require the development of new standards, like they're doing with 322 and 323, the water shapes and the low carbon and the energy performance of concrete masonry. This is an example of ASCE 24. I don't understand it. I fought against it. But if I put a concrete slab on a footer, the IRC, this is for residential, the IRC says that that footer only needs to be 6 inches thick. That's allowed. But for some reason, representatives from FEMA said, we won't allow a slab with a thickened edge. Have no idea what their rationale is. It makes absolutely no sense to me. But we need engagement. We need the experts. Carrie and I are not experts on everything concrete. We have a couple hundred committees meeting here at convention. We need to pull that expertise into these processes so that they are getting the accurate and most information about concrete. Shamim alluded to some of our issues on in the IBC related to fire, flame spread and combustibility. They're actually asking for us to conduct combustibility tests on concrete. And they're saying, well, you could put fibers in there. Well, yeah, it's like 28 pounds of fiber in a ton and a half of concrete. The combustibility test says it's not combustible if there's less than a 50% loss of material. I don't think 28 pounds of fiber in a concrete mix is going to result in a 50% loss of material in a fire test. So these are the types of things that we struggle with because there's people out there doing things without having appropriate knowledge about concrete. So they need to be educated. We need to move them on. There's more and more opportunities. We have multiple guides out there on foundations and foundation systems, whether they're drilled piers, piles, not written in mandatory language. Since we didn't write it, ASCE is writing the standard on how to design and construct concrete foundations. Do they have the expertise that exists at ACI? No, they do not, because they're balanced, because they're doing not just concrete, but steel and wood and gravel systems. So it's much broader. So we really need to step up and make sure we're getting the right information out there in mandatory language. The ICC, in response to the Surfside building collapse in Florida, has formed a committee to write an existing building guide. I served on that committee, and because it's a guide, we have quite a few documents that will be referenced in that guide. But the next step in the ICC process will be to turn this into a standard. The only one that I will be able to keep in there when it's a standard is 562 because that's the only one that's written in mandatory language. We have nothing. So we need to change what we're doing. There's lots of standards out there. The building code doesn't stop at just the language that's in the building code. The building codes are referencing multiple standards developed by a variety of standards writing bodies, including ICC has their own. They're also an SDO and writing standards in addition to publishing codes. We didn't have a standard on 3D printed concrete. Guess who's writing one? ICC, because there's a need. We missed out on the foundations. ASCE is doing that. We're missing out on the 3D printed. ICC is doing that. They're doing one on wildfires. This is the stuff that's going on out there, and we're not at the table. Then, in addition, since it's advocacy, it's not just about it's not just about working with the codes and in the code system. We got to get all the stakeholders on board. And that's the structural engineers, the architects, the building owners, yes, the code development people, but it's also the related concrete materials, the materials. A lot of times we have to work with the steel and wood industry to make sure all the material, aluminum, glass, whomever, to make sure that everybody's issues are being addressed. We have to work with disaster mitigation through FEMA and the local and state emergency management officials, the environmental groups, whether it's ASHRAE, EPA, or DOE at the national level. It could be the DNR, ASHRAE chapters, and regional and state entities at the local level. Then there's the engineering communities, and probably the group that has the most political influence at the national level and local level is the home builders. They are very well connected, very powerful lobbying groups, so they are out there. Has anybody heard of Eric Qualman? Okay, this is good then. This is very good. No hands. The next part that I'm going to do is, the idea came to me from listening to something that Eric, who is a renowned author on digital leadership, that's one of his books. But I need everybody to stand up. Okay. So kind of place your feet, good hearty stance. Hands, fists on your hips. Ladies, you might want to look a little to the left. Okay. You have the power. You can be the Wonder Women and Supermen of the concrete industry by going out and advocating and getting others to advocate. So thank you all. I hope you do something with it. There's a lot that we can accomplish. There's a lot that we can do. Carrie went through this list. You can identify the players, whether it's national outside the U.S., state and local. We need to educate all of these stakeholders. It's complex. It's a lot. But if we all just take a small role in it, there's thousands of people here at ACI. We can do this. It's not that complicated. We made it sound real complicated, but when you're working with us one-on-one, there's lots of opportunities. Step up, contact Carrie and I. We're happy to work with any other groups to help satisfy the mission. These two articles are in the November edition of CI. The evolution, the information Dave went through, advocacy, what you can do, which is a combination of what Carrie and Shamim and I talked about. That's out there. If you want a hard copy, I have some hard copies printed out here in the front of the room, but we can do it. And if we get out there and advocate, it's not just good for ACI, it's good for the public. We're writing these important documents. We're writing minimum criteria for adoption to safeguard the public. So thank you, and I'm sure the public will thank you as well.